Imagine your heating breaks tonight. No thermostat, no space heater, no blanket ordered from a warehouse somewhere, no delivery app bringing something hot to your door. Just you, the cold, and a genuine question of whether you'll still be functioning by morning. Now, stretch that single bad night out across an entire season, then repeat that season every single year for roughly 300,000 years straight. That wasn't a disaster scenario for our ancient ancestors. That was simply how winter worked, for the entire span of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and for the Neanderthals, who were already managing Ice Age conditions long before we showed up. And if you assume a hard winter in Scandinavia today sounds rough, you genuinely have no reference point for what was coming. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, average global temperatures ran about 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. 6 degrees sounds almost trivial when written down like that. In practice, it's the difference between a modern city sitting comfortably ice-free and that same location buried under a kilometer of solid glacier. Enormous stretches of North America, Europe, and Asia disappeared beneath ice sheets that ran for thousands of kilometers. Even in the regions that weren't glaciated, where people actually lived, winter temperatures regularly dropped into a range that modern humans, wrapped in synthetic insulation and carrying satellite weather forecasts, would genuinely struggle to survive for more than a few days. And the landscape was still full of life. Woolly mammoths, cave bears, woolly rhinoceros. Cave lions were noticeably larger than the African lions alive today. Irish elk carrying antlers spanning well over 3 meters tip to tip. These animals weren't backdrop scenery. They were simultaneously the greatest physical danger in this world and the single most critical resource keeping human groups alive. Sea levels, meanwhile, sat roughly 120 meters lower than today, meaning land masses now separated by open water were connected by dry ground. Britain was physically attached to continental Europe. A now submerged plain called Beringia linked Siberia directly to Alaska. The map of the world looked genuinely unrecognizable, and ancient humans were routinely walking across entire landscapes that now sit permanently underwater. So how did they actually survive this? Start with the technology that deserves considerably more credit than it usually receives. Fire. Humans had already been controlling fire for somewhere between 400,000 and roughly 1,000,000 years by the time real Ice Age winters became the defining survival challenge. With the earliest secure archaeological evidence, microscopic traces of controlled burning at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, dating back close to 1,000,000 years. By the time the deep cold actually arrived, fire wasn't a fresh discovery. It was ancient, deeply understood, and structurally load-bearing for everything human society was built on. What most people underestimate is just how many separate jobs fire was doing simultaneously. It cooked food, and this mattered enormously, because cooked food is dramatically easier to digest and delivers considerably more usable energy than the same food eaten raw. Evolutionary biologist Richard Wrangham has argued that this single shift is very plausibly what allowed the human brain to expand as dramatically as it did across our evolutionary history, a direct trade of costly gut tissue for costly brain tissue, since cooking effectively pre-digested food that a larger gut would otherwise have needed to process. Fire didn't only keep bodies warm, it very possibly made the species smarter. Fire also kept predators at bay through the long, dangerous nights. Camped out in an Ice Age landscape, worried about a cave lion, an animal that could weigh up to 300 kilograms and had absolutely no evolved reason to fear a single human standing in front of it, a well-tended fire functioned as your single most dependable bodyguard. Large predators generally do not like fire. They keep their distance. You sleep, you wake up the next morning. Beyond that, fire-hardened wooden spear tips became more effective weapons, provided light through winters where full darkness could stretch across 16 hours a day, which in turn enabled the storytelling, teaching, and communal bonding that kept a group psychologically intact across months of enforced confinement. It dried soaked clothing, which in genuinely freezing conditions is the specific difference between discomfort and hypothermia, and it warmed enclosed spaces, caves, and built shelters up to temperatures the human body could actually keep functioning inside. The knowledge of how to start and maintain fire was itself one of the single most valuable things a person in the Ice Age could carry around in their head. Losing your fire, watching it go out in a blizzard with no reliable way to relight it, was a potential death sentence. Which means the person whose specific role was tending the communal flame, the firekeeper, was very likely among the most quietly essential members of any early human group. not necessarily the strongest hunter, the one who kept the fire alive. If you're picturing ancient humans simply crawling into whatever cave happened to be nearby, the actual picture is considerably more organized than that. Caves genuinely were used, and they were excellent natural shelters. A sufficiently deep cave holds a relatively stable internal temperature year-round, typically somewhere in the range of 10 to 13 degrees Celsius, regardless of what's happening outside. In the middle of a glacial winter, that's not warm by any modern standard, but combined with fire and shared body heat, it's genuinely survivable. Cave walls also block wind directly, which matters enormously, because wind chill can drag an already dangerous temperature into lethal territory within a matter of minutes. Caves weren't always conveniently positioned where people actually needed to be, though. Resources moved, animals migrated, people followed. When there was no cave available, ancient humans didn't sit in the open snow and hope. They built. Archaeological evidence across Europe and Asia shows that occupied cave shelters had genuinely organized interior layouts, stone-lined fire pits positioned specifically to distribute heat efficiently, clearly designated sleeping zones separate from areas used for tool-making and food preparation, and evidence of dedicated storage space. This wasn't an animal taking shelter in a hole. This was a deliberate, planned use of interior space. And then there are the mammoth-bone houses. In parts of Ukraine, one of the most famous examples sitting at the site of Mammoths, archaeologists have uncovered circular structures built almost entirely from mammoth bone and tusk, dating to roughly 15,000 years ago. 4 separate structures at the site were built using a combined total of 149 individual mammoth bones, femurs, shoulder blades, jaw bones, and vertebrae, carefully interlocked and stacked into functioning walls, then covered with stretched animal hide to create a windproof, reasonably weatherproof living space. Think about what that actually required. These builders had no timber industry, no metal fasteners, no concrete. What they had was the remains of an enormous animal, stone and bone tools, and enough collective engineering knowledge to work out that curved bones braced against each other in specific configurations, with tusks lashed overhead as a ridge beam, produce a structure that stays upright and keeps the wind out. Recent radiocarbon analysis published by researchers at Leiden University has suggested that at least one of these structures may have been reoccupied and maintained across several centuries, rather than built and abandoned quickly, which points toward Mammoths functioning as a genuinely stable, long-term settlement rather than a single desperate improvisation. Inside these structures, archaeologists have recovered hearths, decorated objects including a mammoth skull painted with a pattern researchers believe may represent flames, and even a fragment of carved mammoth tusk, some have interpreted as a rudimentary map. Evidence that this was somewhere people actually lived, cooked, made tools, raised children, and waited out the long northern winters together. Modern culture is oddly obsessed with the idea of solitary survival, the lone figure in the wilderness making fire from 2 sticks for a television camera while a production crew waits nearby in a heated vehicle. Ancient humans were doing the opposite, essentially, and it was entirely intentional. Hunter-gatherer bands typically ran somewhere between 20 and 50 core individuals, connected outward through broader social networks reaching hundreds or even thousands of people across a wider territory. This wasn't a loose social arrangement that happened to be convenient. It was survival infrastructure, actively built and maintained, and everyone understood it as such. In winter specifically, when resources were scarce and the margin for a single mistake was close to zero, you needed people who specialized. You needed someone who genuinely knew how to butcher a large animal efficiently enough to extract maximum caloric value from every part of the carcass, the organs, the marrow, and the fat most people would overlook entirely. You needed someone who knew exactly which roots still held nutrition under a meter of packed snow and precisely where to dig. You needed the elder who remembered a similarly brutal winter 15 years earlier and could recall which specific valley had still held deer when everywhere else had gone quiet. You needed community, deliberately built and carefully maintained, because individual survival and group survival weren't really separate things. The winter months, when outdoor activity was necessarily limited, were very likely the primary window for transmitting exactly this kind of knowledge. Stories told around a fire weren't simply entertainment. They were education, generations of hard-won survival knowledge compressed into narratives that could actually be remembered and passed forward accurately. The older woman who knew every useful plant across a 100-kilometer radius wasn't a burden the group tolerated. She was, functionally, a library. and an irreplaceable one. Humans are, biologically, remarkably naked apes, carrying almost none of the dense body hair most other primates rely on. Left unclothed in sub-zero temperatures, a human loses body heat faster than metabolism alone can replace it, and dies of hypothermia within hours. The fact that we're here at all today, rather than an extinct footnote beside some cousin species that simply kept its fur, comes down almost entirely to clothing. Researchers have used a genuinely clever indirect method to estimate roughly when humans first started wearing regular clothing, tracking the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, since body lice can only survive by living directly in fabric rather than on skin. That divergence dates to approximately 170,000 years ago, our earliest solid indication that humans were covering themselves habitually. Simple covering evolved rapidly into something far more sophisticated. By the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, the evidence for genuinely advanced clothing technology is remarkable. Bone needles recovered from sites across Europe and Siberia are so finely crafted that modern researchers attempting to replicate them using only period-appropriate tools have found the task genuinely difficult. With the eye of some surviving needles barely a millimeter across, precision instruments requiring real skill both to manufacture and to use. The burial site at Sung-Hir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, provides the single most vivid picture we have of Ice Age clothing. A double-child burial there, 2 children laid head-to-head, was found covered in an almost unbelievable quantity of individually carved ivory beads, more than 10,000 across the pair combined, each bead estimated to have taken over an hour to produce, using a careful, repeated technique. A separate adult male burial at the same site carried roughly 3,000 beads of his own. The precise arrangement of those beads, laid in careful rows across the skeletons, has allowed researchers to reconstruct the actual garments. A close-fitting inner layer, an insulating middle layer, and a tougher weatherproof outer layer, complete with hats, trousers, and shoes. That's essentially the same layered clothing system modern mountaineering guides still recommend today, arrived at roughly 34,000 years ago through pure trial and error passed down across generations. People who got the design wrong didn't survive to refine it. People who got it right did, and taught what they knew. The hides themselves were processed through a labor-intensive technique called brain tanning, using an animal's own brain tissue mixed with water to chemically soften and preserve the skin, producing genuinely supple, durable leather with real insulating and weatherproofing qualities. Every large animal successfully hunted supplied food and also raw material for clothing, footwear, blankets, tent covering, and carrying bags. Nothing was wasted, because in these conditions, nothing could afford to be. Here's something your body doesn't clearly announce until you're already in serious trouble. Staying warm in genuinely cold conditions burns an enormous number of calories. Basal metabolic rate in extreme cold can rise by 50% or more as the body works to defend its core temperature, and layer real physical activity on top of that. Hunting, building, hauling firewood, and the caloric demand becomes severe. In an Ice Age winter, insufficient food didn't mean gradually feeling tired and a bit chilly. It meant hypothermia, slowed thinking, failing coordination, and death, often quickly. Which is exactly why fat, not protein, not carbohydrate, functioned as the single most valuable currency of Ice Age nutrition. Fat delivers more than double the energy per gram of either alternative, and it's precisely what the body burns most efficiently to generate heat. This is a large part of why megafauna mattered so intensely. A mature woolly mammoth could weigh up to 6 tons, a substantial share of that mass held in insulating fat beneath the hide and marbled through the tissue, potentially providing somewhere in the range of 500,000 calories from a single animal, enough to sustain a group of 25 people for weeks. Hunting an animal that size was never a simple proposition, 6 times the mass of a modern car, carrying tusks capable of goring a person, with real social intelligence to defend itself. The strategies involved driving animals into boggy ground where they became stuck, ambushes staged at river crossings, and coordinated group hunts using fire and noise to funnel panicked animals toward prepared kill sites, all of which required serious planning and cooperation. Then came the problem of storage. How do you preserve 500,000 calories of meat with no refrigerator? You use the fact that the ground itself is already one. Permafrost, permanently frozen soil, was widespread across Ice Age Eurasia, and ancient humans dug food caches directly into it, using the Earth's natural deep freeze to store meat for weeks or months at a stretch. A deliberate strategy confirmed at multiple sites across Siberia and Eastern Europe. What couldn't be frozen was dried instead. Meat sliced thin and dehydrated over fire or in cold winter air to extend its shelf life dramatically, while rendered fat was stored in containers made from animal bladder or stomach lining. In what amounts to an Ice Age energy bar, ancient humans appear to have produced something functionally close to pemmican, dried pulverized meat blended with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries, calorie-dense and capable of lasting months without spoiling. The autumn months before winter weren't a season of rest. They were a period of intense, organized, large-scale food preparation. The entire group working toward one shared goal, having enough stored to make it to spring. Excavated storage pits at several archaeological sites hold quantities far beyond immediate need, deliberate over-preparation as a buffer against the genuinely worst-case scenario. That's not instinct, that's rational planning under real uncertainty. Not every group tried to simply outlast winter in place. Plenty moved. Evidence for seasonal migration among prehistoric human populations is widespread, tracking reindeer and bison herds that shift hundreds of kilometers between summer and winter range, and time to intercept intensely seasonal salmon runs, offering massive caloric windfalls at specific moments and places. Across Upper Paleolithic Europe, archaeological patterns suggest many groups spent summers in upland regions and shifted into sheltered river valleys for winter, which offered real protection from the worst wind, water that often stayed partly unfrozen even in extreme cold, and game animals that were independently seeking the same lower, sheltered ground. What makes these migration patterns genuinely impressive is how clearly planned they were, not improvised. Analysis of stone tool materials at various sites shows specific rock types transported over distances of hundreds of kilometers, evidence that these people were moving between known locations along established, repeated routes, carrying resources from one place to another because they already knew exactly where they were headed and intended to return. That represents a mental map of a landscape spanning hundreds of kilometers, held in memory, understood well enough to plan a season around. Fire, shelter, clothing, food, migration. All of it traces back to one underlying capacity, the distinctly human ability to model a problem before it happens and invent a solution to a challenge you can imagine but haven't personally faced yet. No other animal does this at anything close to the human level. A bison in October does not reason that this particular winter looks unusually severe and decides to migrate earlier than usual. A bear doesn't deliberately cache extra food because it has noticed specific environmental signs pointing toward a longer season ahead. An ancient human plausibly did both, and then explained the reasoning to the rest of the group in language sophisticated enough to justify the decision and take feedback on it. The cave paintings at Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, spanning roughly 40,000 to 17,000 years ago, are usually discussed purely as evidence of art and symbolic or spiritual life, and that's very likely true. But they may also have functioned as something closer to a visual reference library. The animals depicted, horses, bison, mammoths, aurochs, reindeer, are rendered with striking anatomical accuracy and behavioral specificity, and some researchers have proposed these paintings partly served as maintained, updated records of local animal behavior and seasonal presence, passed down across generations on the single most durable storage medium available at the time, solid rock. The psychological dimension of winter survival deserves real weight, too. Long confinement, limited food, constant background stress, and the genuine knowledge that not everyone in the group might see spring. That's a recipe for exactly the kind of internal conflict and social fracture that can destroy a group faster than any single storm. Ancient human communities appear to have understood this intuitively. Evidence for shared ritual, ceremony, and music, including bone flutes recovered from sites dating back some 40,000 years, points toward deliberate cultivation of group cohesion and psychological resilience through the darkest stretch of the year. A group that holds together through the worst months is likely to survive. A group that fractures usually doesn't. These weren't people merely enduring their environment. They were actively managing it, shaping landscapes through controlled fire, regulating animal populations through selective hunting, and tending their own group's psychology through shared culture and ritual. The human relationship with winter was never passive endurance. It was active, coordinated, intelligent problem-solving at a level of sophistication we still consistently underestimate. We eventually traded all of it for central heating, supermarkets, synthetic winter jackets, and the ability to order something hot delivered to our door at midnight. Which, on balance, is a genuinely excellent trade, no complaints.